Let's open the 7glow start.aep. Just double click on that. And I want you to toggle open the examples folder, and holding down the option key, double click on the 7glow.mov, and let's select the tilde key to put that full screen, and we're going to hit the 0 on the numeric keypad to RAM preview this. And this is the lesson that we're going to be working on now. What you're looking at might look like a particle system, but it's actually the text tool. So what we're going to do in this lesson is use the text tool as a particle generator. Let's stop that. I'm going to hit any key on the keyboard, hit the tilde key, and I'm actually going to close this. Let's toggle collapse the examples folder, and I want you to select 7logo.psd. This is the 7 logo that we've created it in a previous lesson. What we're going to do is just drag this to the composition icon on the bottom of the project window, and this will create a composition that's 1000 by 1000. So if we scroll, you see nothing's happening. It's just our Photoshop document. So what we're going to do, this is basically our placeholder for our text effects as well as being affected itself. So I want to stretch this out a little bit to about there. I'm going to start adding some effects onto our 7. So in the effects and preset panel, let's type in simple choker. Okay, let's double click on simple choker to add it to our layer, and we're going to stretch this out just a little bit, and we're going to adjust the choke mat. But before doing that, let's move down on the timeline a little bit. So let's go to 15 frames on the timeline and set our choke mat to 100. Now, the neat thing about the choke mat is if you have an alpha channel, you can use it as a transitional element to resolve your logo. So we can take that out, we can bring it back in. We're going to set that to 100 to make sure it is completely gone. We're going to set a keyframe there. Let's move down to the timeline to 1 second and put that to 0. So it's back. Let's move down the timeline to 115 and set a keyframe there. If we hold down the Option key and just click on the choke mat, if you're on a PC, you can hold down the Alt key and we click once. That'll set a keyframe for us. And let's move down to 2 seconds and set our last keyframe to 100%. I'm going to stretch this up just a little bit. Now the next thing is we don't need 5 seconds for this, so we're going to trim this off. So selecting the layer, let's select Option, back bracket. That'll trim the back of that layer. And let's also type the letter N. That'll trim our workspace. And I want you to right-click on the work area and go to Trim Comp to Work Area so that we're working with 2 seconds. We scroll on this, you can see it appears and then disappears. Let's add our next effect to the 7 logo. So going back up to Effects and Presets, just want you to type in Fractal. And we're going to bring in, collapse this, we're going to bring in Fractal Noise, just double click on it. I want you to go to the beginning of the timeline, and we're going to set some fractal noise for this. The first thing we're going to do is change the fractal type from basic to dynamic. In fact, I'm going to move in a little bit so you can actually see the changes here. And I'm also going to zoom up, Command plus, a couple of times so we can actually see what's going on. The next thing I'm going to do is change the contrast. So we can drag this, really adjust the contrast here. You can actually set it to 500. The next thing we're going to do is change the overflow. So I want to get a solarized effect, so I'm going to go to Wrap Back. And this will give us a nice solarized effect with our fractal noise. Now let's go add some keyframes to this so that our fractal noise can animate. So I want you to go to the beginning of the timeline, you can hit the Home key, and let's change our evolution. So let's set a keyframe for evolution, currently where it is. Let's go to the end of the timeline, and we can set our evolution to 2. So basically what's going to happen is this is going to revolve 2 times around, so we get this nice movement in our fractal. Let's move back to the beginning, and let's add some more effects. So I want you to go to the Effects and Presets, and let's type in CC Radial Fast Blur. We don't have to type the whole thing in, it'll show up. And let's toggle collapse Animation Presets, and double click on CC Radial Fast Blur. I'm going to collapse Fractal Noise. And we're going to bring this a little bit in the middle so you can see what fast blur does. I'm also going to stretch this out so you can read it a little bit better. So what fast blur is, it's basically a zoom blur. So we have three controls on this. We have a center target. This is basically saying where it starts to blur and push out from. We have the amount, so we can increase how much blur we're having from the target. And we also have a zoom. So we have standard, brightest, and darkest. We're going to be using brightest. Get this nice effect. So let's change the settings for this. I'm going to go back to 500 by 500 to center this. I'm going to change my amount to 75. And I'm going to keep it on brightest. So this is what we have. We have the 7 appears, moves around a little bit, and we'll RAM preview this in a little bit. So let's add another effect to this, and that's the vector blur. So we're going to go back up to Effects and Presets, CC Vector. Now, if this bothers you that we're getting the animation presets, you can actually set this to just show effects by turning off Show Animation Presets, and now we just have the effect set. So in here, I just want you to double-click on CC Vector Blur. That'll add it to our 7. Let's pull this out just a little bit so we can see the entire thing. And let's change some settings for this. So for the amount, we're going to set that to 50. So we get this nice watery looking blur to this. We're also going to change the ridge smoothness to 25 and the map softness to 10. Okay, let's stretch this out. Actually, I'm just going to hit the tilde key. It'll be easier. And let's RAM preview this. Let's hit 0 on the numeric keypad. I'm going to move my mouse out of the way, and we'll see what this looks like. And here we have our transition for a 7. This will simulate the lightning strike that will happen from our lightning that we have in our background layer. Let's stop this. You can hit any key to stop it. Let's hit the tilde key, and I'm going to just toggle collapse these for a second. Stretch this out a little bit. I want you to turn off the effects for now. So the F with the black circle around it, if you just click on that, it'll turn off all the effects. Because now we're going to use the 7 as a placeholder. I also want you to go in and change the transparency. This will be temporary. So under opacity, let's type in 25%. 25 and hit return. So let's switch from our standard workspace to our text workspace. I'm going to stretch this a little bit to the side because we're going to need to see as much as possible. Right about there. I'm also going to stretch this down. I'm going to put on my title safe and action safe. And let's change our character. So I'm going to put in Times New Roman. And we're going to change the point size to 12. And we're going to change the tracking to 200. We're going to make sure we have a solid white in our text color. We're also going to change the width of the text to 200%. Let's get our type tool. And let's type in Storm Tracker 7 in all caps. Let's go back to our Move tool, and we will center this up. There's a couple of more things we have to do. Make sure you are centered on your paragraph. That's very important. And also, we're going to zoom in a little bit. So I'm just Command plus, plus, plus. You see my anchor point is at the bottom of the C. I want you to bring that up by moving the baseline. So let's just center that to about here. Go make sure I have my Move tool. And we'll just center that up a little bit over here. Change my baseline a little bit more, right about there. So -4 on your baseline should be fine. I'm going to reduce this down, Command minus a couple of times. The next thing we're going to do is get our pen tool, because we're going to create a path and then have our text animate along our path. Before we start creating our path, make sure that Roto Bezier is turned off and click right about here. So we're going to click and drag to the right, about there. We're going to move to the center top of the 7. We're going to click and drag right about there. We're going to move to the center right of the 7. We're going to click and drag going down till we make our curve. We're going to the bottom center of the 7. We're going to click and drag Complete that curve. The center left of the 7, click and drag, right about there. And then we're going to move all the way over here, say right here, and then just click and drag to finish our path. You might have to do this a couple of times, but the more you practice with your path, the easier it gets. Let's go back to the Move tool, and we're going to stretch this back just a little bit to here and to here. And I want you to do Command minus once so we can see more of our screen. I'm actually going to stretch this up to about there. I want you to toggle open the Storm Tracker layer, and under Text, toggle that open. Stretch this up a little bit more. I want you to go to Path Options. Under Path Options, where it says None, toggle that open and go to Mask 1. Now the type will be riding along the path. So let's set some keyframes for this. Let's go to the beginning of the timeline. You can hit the Home key, and I want you to go to your first margin. You can see if you drag on your first margin, it'll ride along the path. So we're going to drag this until it leaves the screen. If you want to set some numbers in there to make this a little bit easier, just click on the numbers, and we're going to set in -1040. So it's completely out of the screen. Let's set a keyframe there, and I want you to go to the end of the timeline. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to have the text animate in and then disappear. But we're going to stop the text around here. And again, if you want to just type in the number, it's about 170. And if we drag along, this is what we end up with. Type comes in and stops about there. Now I'm going to turn off my mask preview so that we don't have to look at that anymore. We can see our type. And we're going to animate a little bit more on our text properties. So let's toggle collapse, the path options. Let's go to animate and select the scale property. Let's go to the beginning of the timeline, and we're going to reduce the scale to 0, so it starts at nothing. We'll set a keyframe there. Then let's move to 1 second and set the scale to 500. You'll see how large this gets. 500. Now let's go to the end of the timeline and set that back down to 0. And if I scrub on this, we can see the type comes in and then goes away. And I'm going to adjust this a little bit because I want the type to continue a little bit further. So let's go to the end. And I'm going to type the letter U so I can see my keyframes. And on my first margin, I'm just going to drag that a little bit further. Say about there. Let's see what this looks like. Yeah, that's a lot better. So let's put in 625 for our animation. And you might have to put in a different number. Depending on how your path was built, we'll probably all have to have our numbers just a little bit different. But that looks exactly how I want it to look. Okay, we're going to put a couple of more text properties in there. So I want you to toggle collapse the storm tracker, toggle it back open so we can see our text, close down path options. Let's rename Animator 1 to Text Scale. Let's go and open up the Range selector. And I want you to go and open up Advanced. And what we're going to do, let's scroll this just a little bit, is we're going to taper the end of our text layer. Right here where it says Shape Square, that's basically giving us an even shape from one selector to the next selector. I want you to switch that to Ramp Up. This way we have a thin end on one side and a thick end on the other. So if we scroll, you can see that our text ends up having a tail. Okay, let's go and collapse our advanced setting and collapse text scale. And we're going to add another property in there. So let's go Animate, Rotation, and we're going to add another property onto our rotation, which is actually the wiggly selector. And this will give us random rotations on our character. So I just want you to go to rotation, and let's just type in 1. And you can see now that our characters are rotated and randomized. Let's rename Animator 1 to Text Rotate Wiggle. Let's hit return, and let's collapse that. And we're going to animate a couple of other features in our text. Let's add the position animator, and we're going to also add onto animator 1, which is our position animator, the scale property and the rotation property. We'll also stretch this up a little bit. Let's go to the beginning of the timeline. Let's hit the home key, and let's set keyframes for position, scale, and rotation. Let's change those properties a little bit. Let's change the scale property to 0. Let's move down the timeline to 1 second, and let's change our scale property to 300. So now we're really increasing the size of our scale. Let's also move down the timeline all the way to the end, if you just hit the end key. And let's change our position to 1000. So if we stretch this, actually I want you to see this a little bit better. So we'll stretch this out, scroll this up a little bit, so we can change our position. We'll change that to 1000 on the X position and 200 on the Y position. Let's change our scale. We're going to break the chain to 1000 on the X and 0 on the Y. And we're also going to change our rotation to 1. So this is what we have. All of our type spiraling off and off to the side. Now, we want this to be a little bit more random than what it is. So we're going to add a wiggly selector to this. So let's go Add, Selector, Wiggly. And you can see it's a little bit more random as it goes out. Now, we're going to change the wiggly selector a little bit. Let's open that up. And right now, the wiggles per second is set to 2. So we don't want that to randomize over 2 seconds. We just want that to be set to 0. So now if we move this across, see all of our type just kind of spreads out. Let's go and toggle collapse our wiggly selector and toggle collapse animator 1, and let's rename that text separate. And the last thing we're going to do to our type is we're going to animate the tracking. So let's go animate tracking. I'm going to stretch this up a little bit. Click off of that. And let's go to 1 second on the timeline. Let's set a keyframe at 0 for our tracking amount. Let's go to the end of the timeline and drag that to 200. So if we drag that, you can see all of the type just goes away. So now if we scroll on this, we have the type, touches the 7, and then spreads out kind of like an explosion. Now that we've set up our text, we can actually start setting up some effects for this. So let's stretch this down a little bit so we can see it a little bit better. And let's go to our effects and presets, and we're going to find our force motion blur effect. So let's just type in CC force, and there it goes. We'll just double click on this. We'll stretch out our effects palette. Let's move to the middle here. And we're going to zoom in just a little bit so you can see this. So what force motion blur is doing is actually adding motion blur to our text. We want this just a little bit smoother. So let's change some of the properties in there. We're going to increase the motion blur levels from 8 to 10. And we're going to also increase the shutter angle from 180 to 250. So this will give us longer streaks. If you really, really wanted to have a drastic look, you can set it to 500, get a lot longer streaks. You can set the levels to a higher level, you get a lot smoother look in there. For what we're going to do, 10 is fine, and so is 250. Our next effect will be radial fast blur. Let's just double click on that. And again, this is just like a zoom blur effect. So let's set the amount to 75. And let's set the zoom from standard to brightest. If we scrub on this, kind of get an idea of what we're going to get. This wraps around our 7. Let's go to about 1 second. We have one last effect to add to this, and that's the vector blur. So let's just type in vector, double click on that, and let's change some of the settings. So let's set the amount to about 50. Let's set the ridge smoothness to 25 and the map softness to 10. Now if we click on this, hit the tilde key, we can preview what we have. So hit 0 on the numeric keypad, and this will help with the lightning that comes in and wraps around our 7 to create the transition. Let's hit any key to stop that. Click on the tilde key. Let's reduce the size just a little bit. Let's collapse Storm Tracker, and let's duplicate that. So Command D. And what we're going to do now, we're not going to have to change any of the effects or any of the text animations. All we need to do is change the path. So I want you to type M for mask, select the mask shape, and just hit delete. Let's turn on the mask preview, and let's also get our pen tool, and we're going to stretch this out a little bit because we want to see the bottom of this layer, and let's start creating our new path. So let's click right about here and stretch this out. We'll go up to where the 7 meets the circle and stretch that out to here. And what we're trying to do is have this trace the shape or the curve of the 7. Then we'll go to about here, click in, and continue that curve. So that should be perfect. So let's stretch this up, stretch this out a little bit. Let's toggle collapse the Storm Tracker layer, open it up again, and under text, under path options, set it to mask 1. Let's scroll down a little bit so we can see our first margin, and we're going to adjust that. So let's go to the beginning of the timeline, and on our first margin, just bring this down till it disappears. And we're going to have to stretch this down a little bit so we can see the bottom, and make that maybe a little bit smaller. And we want that to go off the screen. So just drag it down, drag it down. If you want to hold down Shift, it'll go a lot faster till it's right about there. If you want to set in a number, I'm going to set in -865, set a keyframe there. We'll go to the end of the timeline and drag it. I'm going to hold down Shift again. So it goes up and disappears off. And we can set that right about here. We'll actually set it to 500. And I'm going to put it back to fit up to 100%. Let's collapse our text. Let's turn the effects back on for the logo. And let's change the transparency back to 100%. We'll select composition window, select the tilde key, and let's do a RAM preview by selecting 0 on the numeric keypad. So now that we have this finished, we can see that we've changed simple text into a particle generator. And if you get the chance, really experiment with this because you can really do some amazing things with the type tool and adding some effects onto it. So let's stop this down. Let's hit the tilde key, composition, make movie. We'll name this 7 Glow. Hit save, hit the tilde key, and set it to render.